Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Beth Burke and Chris Sands.
Hello, and welcome back to Canusa Street. I'm Beth Burke with the Canadian American Business Council, joined by my fantastic co-host, Professor Chris Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Beth. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing well, although, every time I come on the street and I see you standing there, you always have compliments. So how could I be otherwise than great?
I mean, I'm your biggest fan. I feel like I've, jumped into the Scotty role of being the number one fan club member.
Well, Scotty is an inspiration to us all, and but you filled her shoes and then some.
I'm super excited about today. We have quite an impressive guest joining us. Chris, I will turn over to you to do the proper introduction.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited as well. Vincent Rigby is the Slater Professor of Practice, formerly the McConnell Visiting Professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. He recently retired from Canada's public service after 30 years in a variety of departments and agencies across government, including the Privy Council Office, Global Affairs Canada, Public Safety, the Department of National Defence, and the former Canadian International Development Association, CIDA. His career focused on security and intelligence, foreign policy, defense, and development issues, obviously with those titles. And his last position, which is really interesting, is that he was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2020 to 2021. And that means that he was advising current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He has a number of other roles. He's just sort of an amazing guy. Everybody wants to work with him. He is a senior fellow with the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University and a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And we're really, really glad to have you. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you to both of you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
I know, I'm getting excited to hear all the secrets. You've got all the goods, right?
Well, there is a Security of Information Act that I've got to be cognizant of. I'm always afraid I'm going to get myself in trouble. I love to tell stories and I love to tell anecdotes, but I also want to stay out of jail if I possibly can. So I'll be open as I can, but with that one caveat.
Well, we don't want you in jail, although we could probably do a podcast from jail.
I'm glad you have that flexibility. I really am.
It's really exciting to have you here, and there's so much going on globally, and would just love, from your perspective and your background, just a little sense on what you think the hottest button issue is right now.
Oh boy, that's a great question. Where do I start? And which hot button issue should I focus on? I think from a Canadian perspective right now, and Chris has heard me pontificate on this a number of times, so I will not in any way, shape, or form be annoyed, Chris, if you start to yawn and go, I've heard it before. But I just think there's so much out there. I won't focus on one hot button issue in the sense of a crisis or a specific situation. But I think for me, from a Canadian perspective, it's Canada and the world writ large. And where does Canada stand in terms of international security issues, on national security, on national defense, and a world that continues to get increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. It's a world full of turmoil. You guys know this. Your audience knows this. We don't have to go into the details of what's happening out there right now. But how is Canada going to respond? And is Canada going to step up to the plate? And I think for a number of commentators, I think for a number of allies of Canada, of other countries around the world, there have been some question marks over the last year or two about Canada's position on some of these issues. Is Canada going to play a role that is commensurate with its history? Because Canada, I think, has been there in the past when it comes to troubled times. So are we going to step up diplomatically from a security perspective with our defense forces? Are we going to be able to help the United States, help our allies in responding to many of these big global crises that are out there, and crises that are manifesting themselves internationally, but inevitably blow back domestically. And all the stuff you're seeing in Canada right now, in terms of hostile state activities, Chinese foreign interference, and so on, have an international origin. So So where is Canada on the world stage? With or Canada on the world stage would be my big number one hot button issue at the moment.
And Vincent, do you think that's a question of capability or will? And I say that because I think a lot of Canadians are proud of their global role, but we've seen some of the writing, in the media lately about, the state of Canada's foreign service. And of course, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came out in Canada with a report on the state of the foreign service. We've seen reductions in development assistance, and obviously the question that Americans are always thinking about Canada's defense spending, which isn't quite at the 2% target that of the Wales commitment in NATO. So where do you see it? Is it really that Canada has a voice, it just doesn't have the means to project it? Or is it a question of Canada lacks the will to engage in an increasingly dangerous world and would like to sort of stick to its knitting and maybe be almost a little bit isolationist at times?
I think it's a combination of both. I think that there is a lack of capability, but to a considerable extent, that lack of capability is because of a lack of will. And I don't want to point the finger too much at the current government, because this is a perennial problem for Canada. So on the one hand, I was saying that Canada has a pretty proud global tradition. I think they do. We've been there when the chips are down. You look at our proud military tradition in terms of stepping up when there are major conflicts. I think you and I were having a conversation about this just the other day, Chris, going back to the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Balkans in the 1990s, Afghanistan. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. We're always there. But I find often that we wait until the crisis is there and then we have to really throw things together at the last minute and engage. I think that Canada has struggled for a long time, not just governments, but Canadians writ large. And then I think this reflects on governments. They've had a problem coming to terms with global threats. And some of the polls that have been appearing recently have been quite interesting. You ask Canadians, is the world a more dangerous place? And they'll go, yes, absolutely. I mean, look at all the things that are happening out there, from Gaza to Ukraine to a rising China. And then the next question they'll ask is, do you feel threatened? No, not particularly. That stuff's all happening over there. And so there's this wonderful phrase that has been coming up a lot lately in the Canadian media, and I've used it a couple of times in articles. And Chris, you'll know that Norman Hilmer, a mutual good friend of us, has told me to stop using it because it's become such a cliche. I think you know what I'm going to say, but it's the fireproof house, right? Senator Raoul Dandurand back in the 1920s said that Canada lives in a fireproof house, far from flammable materials. There's still a little bit of that in Canada. That, yes, there's lots of bad stuff happening, but nothing's ever going to happen to us. Nothing ever has happened to us. And I've said on a number of occasions that it's unfortunate it's very fortunate that we've never had a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11. But sometimes I wonder if that's what it's going to take. And God forbid that we have an event like that, but that's what it's going to take to wake up Canadians. So, and for those who I think look out at the world and go, there are threats out there. There are serious threats, and who do get it. I think, unfortunately, and this is where the Canada-U.S. dimension comes in, there's still a certain complacency that we live next door to the United States, and the U.S. is going to take care of us. And we've always had the United States as a bit of an umbrella, fortress North America, and so the threat's not that serious. But if it does get serious, we share a continent. The Americans aren't going to have a choice but to take care of us. So why should we worry? So this, to bring it back to your question, Chris, will or capability, there's a lack of will, I think, to take the threat seriously and to act. And then because of that, I think our capabilities have started to decline or atrophy a little bit. So whether it's the diplomatic tools, you mentioned the Senate report, whether it's the Canadian Armed Forces, we're quite well below the 2% target. We're down around 1.3, 1.2. Our developmental assistance, some of the stuff we do at home in terms of defending Canadians and Canadian interests against foreign interference and so on. We lack a bit of both right now, intention and capability. And that, unfortunately, has put us in the place that we are, where I think our reputation is really starting to suffer internationally, including in Washington, which is where I think we should be most concerned when that reputation is thrown into question.
I have to jump in. I think it's almost a contractual obligation, since I work at the Woodrow Wilson Center, to acknowledge that Senator Raoul Dandurand of Canada served as president of the League of Nations, which was a Woodrow Wilson venture that the United States nonetheless never joined. And it brings me to CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, rechristened the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was another great U.S. idea that Canada joined and the U.S. never did. When you think about Canada's role in the Indo-Pacific, I know that's a crazy pivot there, but we hear a lot about Canada, aspiring to be in these things, but we're not hearing a lot from Washington about, with invitations, Canada should be part of AUKUS, Canada should be part of the IPEF, the Quad, you name the arrangement. And yet Canada is in CPTPP, is pursuing an arrangement with ASEAN. Where do you see Canada in what some people think is the most important global theater, both economically and geopolitically, the Indo-Pacific?
So it's the one part of the world where I think Canada has done, and this current government has done a little bit of strategic thinking. So I've been quite critical over the last couple of years about how we have to think more strategically about our foreign policy and our foreign policy priorities. Where do we want to play? I often say that Canada is a middle power with great power aspirations, global aspirations, because we've got interests all over the world, and we do have interests all over the world, economic interests, security interests, but we have limited capabilities. Going back to that question of capabilities, so where do you want to focus, and what do you want to do, and how are you going to balance all those competing priorities? So Canada's done well in terms of finally, after many delays, coming out with an Indo-Pacific strategy around about this time last year, and the thing setting out some decent objectives and some goals and some ambitions as to how we will be a player in the Indo-Pacific region. So about a year in, I think they've had some modest success in terms of implementing the strategy. It's got 5 broad objectives. Security and defense is one of those pillars. It had some, I would say, relatively modest funding to support the strategy, about $2.3 billion over 5 years. So we have a critical path, if you want to call it that, a plan to engage more in the Indo-Pacific, because that's often been the criticism in the past, that we sort of pop in and out of the region. So let's see if we can sustain this now. So as I say, there's been some good steps. We've established some positions. We've got an Indo-Pacific trade representative right now in Manila. We've started up some serious dialogues with ASEAN and other countries. We've opened up some other offices. We've deployed a 3rd frigate to the region to help in countering the China threat, although not explicitly putting it that way. For me, though, that you do have some issues with the strategy over the longer term, and I wrote this piece, Chris, as you know, on the policy options recently with a former student of mine, Aftab, where we say that while the progress has been solid and it has been encouraging, there's still a number of elephants in the room, not just one 800-pound gorilla or one big elephant, choose your animal, but a number of them, and they could, over time, undermine the strategy. The first is India, and we're in a bit of trouble with India right now. Again, I don't think I have to tell your audience what those problems are, because they very much involve the United States as well, in terms of assassinations or attempted assassinations of Sikh extremists, alleged Sikh extremists on Canadian and American territory. Our relationship is in a bad place right now with India, but India is the linchpin of the strategy. And if we can't get along with India, I think we're going to have a hard time of making that strategy work. The other big piece is China. And I've been pushing, and I was pushing when I was NSIA, I have a harder line on China. Well, we've gone from one extreme to the other. We have a pretty hard line with China, to the extent that the relationship is really problematic at the moment in terms of trying to get stuff done in a positive way. The bilateral relationship is extremely fraught, very fraught. So how do we move that forward in the region? The third problem is the issue you specifically mentioned. We are being left out of a lot of bodies right now, of organizations in the Indo-Pacific region, and that, I think speaks to what I was saying earlier in terms of our reputation right now, what capabilities we bring to the table. But it's hard to get things done when you're not at those tables. So whether it is IPEF or the Quad or AUKUS, have we asked to get into these organizations? I think in some cases we have, and others maybe not. With the door slammed in our faces, nobody knows for sure. I think even in government, you get different answers from different people depending on where they're sitting at any point in time. But I think if we really want to make a play in that region, we have to be a member of some of these organizations. And then finally, the big one for me is on the security side. And again, Chris, you've heard me talk about this a great deal, but I just feel that it's difficult to be a player in that region by adding one frigate to a current deployment of 2 frigates. So that we have 2 frigates in the region when we don't have other hard capabilities that we can deploy to support the United States and our allies. We aren't going to get our F-35s fully online until into the 2030s. We don't have submarine capability. We're finally going to replace our maritime patrol aircraft, but that's going to take a while. We've got the Chief of the Defense Staff and the head of the Navy saying that it's going to be difficult to sustain ourselves militarily in this region, not 10, 15 years out, but in the next 12 months, like literally in the next 12 months, it's going to be tough. So to answer your question, are we back in the Indo-Pacific region? Well, I would say that we've dipped our big toe in the region, but how much further we can jump into the region is going to depend on what we put out there in terms of money out the door, but in terms of hard capabilities on the military side. And if we can't play on the hard military side, then we at least need to play on the soft security side. Some of the other things that we can do from a public safety perspective, fisheries patrols and disaster response, we can still help out in that area. So lots of potential there. We've laid a foundation, but I do worry about where we're going to be in that region over the longer term.
I'd love to talk about another region because obviously there's not a lack of areas to get involved with, but you spent a lot of time in Arctic policy. And I think, the energy and attention has sort of shifted from the margins of strategic thinking from the U.S. really to the forefront. And we're trying to, the U.S. is trying to quickly adapt to this reality. What do you think the opportunities exist for a U.S.-Canada allyship in approaching Arctic security?
Well, it's a great question. And the Wilson Center and Max Bell held a great conference in Montreal back in June. And we talked about Canada-U.S. cooperation in the Arctic. And we looked at a lot of the aspects of the Arctic, both from a threat perspective and what's up there right now, what we have to worry about. But how can Canada and the U.S. cooperate in terms of responding to some of those threats? The threats both through the Arctic and inside the Arctic. And I think it's interesting, having just spoken about the Indo-Pacific region and China. I think that China as a potential emerging threat in that region, much more active in the Arctic, declared itself a near Arctic state, is now an observer in the Arctic Council. Clearly, they want to play a larger role. We could, if we're not going to play in the Indo-Pacific region specifically, we could play more in the Arctic, and we could do a lot more. So, in terms of what we can do, I think first and foremost, let's get NORAD modernization really moving on steroids. I think the U.S. has been pushing Canada for a while to up its game. We need to modernize the North Warning System to counter modern threats. I think Canada's made an announcement in the last year or so that they're moving in that direction. They've announced funding, but we can't just make announcements. We got to make it happen. So move in that direction. I think Canada can do more in terms of following through on announcements they made in the past. We've got projects in the Arctic dating back to the early years of the Harper government, deploying Arctic offshore patrol ships. We were supposed to deploy 6. We've only deployed 4. I think that was that last count, 3 or 4. That project was announced in 2007. We announced a refueling station on Baffin Island in Nanisivik in 2008, 2009. It's still not fully operational. So get moving on these things. Get them up and running. And not just from a military perspective. We talked a lot about this at the conference in June. Socioeconomic development, human security that complements harder security, defense security countering threats from Russia or China, building up our infrastructure, looking at ways that we can cooperate, Canada and the U.S. in the Arctic in terms of infrastructure in Alaska and Northwest Territories and the high Arctic, and making human security kind of very much at the heart of our combined strategy. And so there's lots and lots to do in the Arctic. I think this is an area where Canada helps itself and its own national interests. It's a huge chunk of Canadian territory. 40% of our territory is in the Arctic. So we should be taking better care of it. We're great on the rhetoric. We love talking romantically about the Arctic in Canada, but we don't necessarily do much. So let's do it in our own national interest. But boy, I think the U.S. would be ecstatic if we didn't necessarily deploy 30 frigates and 8 submarines to the Indo-Pacific, which is never going to happen. But if we help them take care of the Arctic, and often refer to it sort of as our back door. If we could do that, I think it would be great for the relationship. It would be great for NATO because NATO's paying more attention to it. So I said there's so many problems out there right now, so many pressures on Canada to do something. Take a digestible piece and get your teeth into it. And for me, that digestible piece is the Arctic. That's where we should be focusing on. And that's where we can play up our capabilities and we can play a leadership role in the Arctic with some of our fellow NATO members, including the United States and the Nordic members. So I think it's a great question, and I hope we can up our game a little bit in that area.
Vincent, that was fantastic. And always talking to you, I feel like I get a global picture, and the way that you link some of these threads together is tremendous. We should have you back for yet another episode because we've only talked, I think, about the Arctic, Indo-Pacific. Is that half the world? We have another half to go. The world is not enough. I think that's a given. But we are at our time. And I wanted to thank you for coming on. I wanted to thank you for sharing with us the kind of wisdom that Justin Trudeau taps when he can, sharing it with those of us on Canusa Street.
I don't know if the Prime Minister is still talking to me, against some of the things I've said over the last 2 years, but I hope so. And listen, thank you to both of you for having me on the show. This is great, and I would jump at the opportunity to come back. So anytime.
Well, we're going to take you up on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Till next time.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.